Montana Territory, 1879. The wind cut sharp across the plains as Bethany Brooks stepped off the eastbound stagecoach with nothing but a small trunk, a canvas bag, and a baby growing steady beneath her ribs. The town of Red Elk was little more than a scattering of buildings at the base of the hills, its streets muddy from last night's rain. Bethany's boots sank into the earth with every step, but she kept going, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the strap of her bag. Her dress was plain, the hem frayed, and her coat too thin for the early spring chill, but she had made it. That mattered more than the looks she drew from the townsfolk as she passed. She stopped in front of the boarding house first. A woman with a pinched face answered the door, looked her up and down, and asked, "You're expecting?" Bethany nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I can do laundry, cook, clean." "We do not take girls in your position," the woman said, and shut the door. Bethany stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Rejection had stopped hurting weeks ago. It had become expected, like the ache in her lower back or the way her hands trembled when she was tired. She had left Kansas because there was nothing left for her there, not after her fiancé ran off the moment he learned she was carrying his child. Her father had slammed the door in her face. Her mother had cried but done nothing. She had thought maybe here, in a place where everyone was building something from nothing, she might find a way to start over. But Red Elk was smaller than she imagined, less forgiving. She was walking past the livery when she heard a voice behind her. "You lost." Bethany turned. A tall cowboy stood by the fence, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a rope coiled in one hand. He was all dust and sun, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, with a quiet steadiness in his eyes that made her think of rain after weeks of drought. "No," she said, "just looking for work." His eyes dropped to her stomach. Her hand automatically went to cover it. "Folks around here can be narrow," he said. "But not everyone." She gave a tight nod and started to walk on. "I'm Jackson Dwyer," he called after her. She stopped. "Bethany Brooks," she said quietly. "Bethany," he repeated, as if trying the name on his tongue. "You eat yet?" She hesitated. "I'm not asking for charity." "Good," Jackson said, "because I ain't offering any. I was heading over to the diner. Figured I could use company." She studied him. He did not look away. After a long moment, she nodded once. They sat at the back table, where the light hit soft through the dusty window. Bethany was quiet at first, her eyes drifting to the door every time someone entered, but Jackson did not push her to speak. He ate slow, like a man used to silence. When the waitress brought her plate, Bethany stared at it too long. "Everything all right?" Jackson asked. She blinked. "Yes, it's been a while since someone bought me a meal without expecting something." He held her gaze. "Only thing I expect is that you eat." She smiled, just a flicker, and picked up her fork. When they stepped back into the street, the clouds had broken, spilling golden light over the muddy road. Bethany stood with her arms crossed, unsure where to go. Jackson looked at her, then toward the low ridge behind town. "I've got a place," he said, "just outside of Red Elk. It's not much, but there's a roof and a spare room. You'd have privacy, and you wouldn't owe me anything." She stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. "Maybe because you look like you've been told no too many times. And maybe because I do not think carrying life makes you less." Her throat tightened. "Everyone else disagrees." He stepped closer, voice steady. "Then they're wrong. You're just right." Bethany blinked. Hard. She did not answer right away. But when he turned and started walking toward his horse, she followed. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Jackson offered her his coat when the wind picked up. She tried to refuse, but he just draped it over her shoulders without a word. His ranch sat in the valley, tucked between the hills. A simple house, a barn, A few fenced pastures. Nothing fancy but cared for. There was a dog waiting on the porch, tail wagging slow. Jackson introduced him as Boone. The dog sniffed Bethany's hand, then leaned into her side like she belonged there. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and coffee. Jackson showed her the spare room. There was a bed, a small stove, a window that looked out toward the trees. Bethany stood in the doorway, unsure. "I can sleep in the barn if that makes you more comfortable," Jackson said. "You do not need to do that." He nodded once. "All right then." He showed her where the wash basin was, the outhouse out back, and where he kept the tea. Then he left her alone. That night, Bethany lay in the bed with her hand over her belly, listening to the wind outside. For the first time in weeks, she was not cold. She was not scared. And she was not alone. In the morning, Jackson was already outside working. She made coffee and brought it to him. He said, "Thank you," and gave her a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Days passed. Bethany helped in small ways, sweeping the porch, mending clothes, feeding the dog. Jackson never asked anything of her. Every evening, they sat on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the hills, not talking much, but not needing to. One morning, she woke to sharp pain and the sheets damp beneath her legs. It was early, the sky still pale. She gripped the edge of the bed, breathing fast. Jackson was already in the house by the time she called out. He moved fast, steady, like he had done this before. He helped her through the worst of it, boiling water, bringing cloth, holding her hand through every wave of pain. And then, just past noon, a cry split the silence. Bethany wept as Jackson placed the baby in her arms. "A girl," he said softly. Bethany looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect. "Zadie," she whispered. "Her name is Zadie." Jackson smiled, brushing a damp curl from Bethany's forehead. "Zadie," he repeated. He looked at Bethany then, and something changed in the air between them, like the world had shifted and found its right place. "You did good," he said. Bethany held Zadie close, eyes full. "I did not do it alone." "No," he said, "you did not." And even though she had been rejected by everyone else, in that moment, with her daughter in her arms and Jackson by her side, Bethany knew she had finally found home. Bethany folded the last of the linens and set them on the shelf beside the stove, careful not to wake Zadie. The baby slept in a woven cradle Jackson had carved himself, the wood smooth and pale, the edges softened by cloth scraps Bethany had stitched together with slow, steady care. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, their early leaves rustling like distant water. Bethany tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, then stepped out onto the porch. Jackson was at the fence line, checking the wire. His shirt clung damp at his back, and a sheen of sweat darkened the brim of his hat. She watched him move, deliberate, capable, quiet. He didn't speak unless words were needed, but when he did, they stayed in her chest long after. She carried a tin cup of water down to him. He set his gloves on the post and took it with a nod. "Thank you." She leaned against the rail, arms crossed loosely. "You always do your repairs in the heat of the day?" He took a long drink, then glanced toward the hills. Fence was sagging. Didn't want the gelding getting out. "He's got a mind to wander." Bethany tilted her head. "That the gray one with the bad eye?" Jackson nodded once. "Spooked in a storm couple years back. Never fully came right." She looked out over the pasture, where the horse stood near the edge of the creek, tail flicking slow. "Seems like he trusts you." "Maybe. I don't ask more of him than he can give." Bethany turned toward him, the breeze lifting her sleeve. "You always been like that? Patient with broken things?" Jackson didn't answer right away. He set the cup on the post, then rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "Grew up outside Abilene. My father didn't leave much behind but his temper. Learned early what not to be. Bethany's voice was quiet. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Made me look at folks different. Doesn't take much to break someone. Takes more to help them mend. She studied his profile, how the hard lines of his face softened when he wasn't guarding them. He didn't meet her gaze, but she didn't need him to. Something passed between them anyway, like a thread pulled taut between two people who'd learned to live with silence. That evening, Jackson brought home a sack of flour and a tin of dried apples from town. He handed them to her like it was nothing, but she understood the weight of it. Supplies weren't cheap, and he hadn't been to town in weeks. She opened the tin, the scent of sweet fruit rising up. You planning to feed the whole county? He leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed. Thought maybe you'd make those biscuits again. Ones with the sugar crust. Bethany narrowed her eyes. You mean the ones you ate 6 of without a word? He raised an eyebrow. They were warm. She gave a soft laugh, then turned to the counter. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, measuring, mixing, pressing dough into thick rounds. The baby stirred once, then settled again. Jackson lit the lantern as dusk closed in. The flame flickered over the walls, casting long shadows. Bethany placed the biscuits in the oven, then wiped her hands on her apron. Do you ever get lonely out here? She asked. He looked toward the window, where the last light was slipping behind the ridge. Sometimes. Used to think that was just part of living quiet. But lately. She waited. He met her eyes, and this time didn't look away. Lately it feels different. Like the quiet's not so empty. Bethany felt her breath catch. The oven creaked. She turned toward it, pulled the biscuits free, and placed them on a cloth to cool. She didn't speak, not yet, but her heart was thudding steady and strange. They ate on the porch again, the air thick with the scent of warm bread and apples. Boone lay sprawled beneath the steps, tail twitching in his sleep. The stars came out, slow and steady. Bethany leaned back in her chair, her eyes following the arc of one falling across the sky. Jackson spoke low. You think you'll stay? She looked at him, the way his hands rested loose on his thighs, his face turned toward the dark. There was no pressure in his voice, only the quiet hope of someone who had waited a long time without asking. I don't have anywhere else, she said. But even if I did. She let the words hang there. Jackson's eyes found hers, and something in them settled. Bethany stood, reached for the empty plates, and paused. You never asked what happened before I got here. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know. She nodded once. Maybe I will. Just not yet. That's fine, he said. The screen door creaked behind her as she stepped back inside. Zadie slept on, her breath little more than a whisper. Bethany stood at the cradle a long time, fingers brushing the edge of the quilt. Then she turned toward the table and began preparing a pot of tea, the kind Jackson kept for cold nights. When he came in, she handed him a cup and met his eyes. There was no need for promises. Not yet. But the warmth in her chest told her they were already being made. The rain came down slow and steady that morning, soaking the earth until it shone like coal. Bethany stood at the window, her shawl draped over her shoulders, watching the drops gather on the sill. Behind her, Zadie made soft cooing sounds, the kind that meant she'd be hungry soon. Jackson's boots sounded across the porch before he stepped inside, shaking off his hat and hanging it by the door. His coat was slick with rain, his hair darker with it, and his face carried the pale chill of the morning. Creek's rising, he said, voice low. Cattlery holding to the high ground, but I'll need to walk the south fence before noon. Bethany nodded, folding the shawl tighter. You'll need something warm in you first. He glanced toward the stove. Fire still good? I stoked it before sunup. You'll have coffee and porridge in 10 minutes. He lingered, watching her hands as she moved. You sleep all right? She turned just enough to meet his eyes. Some. Zadie had a spell around midnight, but she settled easy. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she felt his warmth. I heard her. Thought about getting up, but figured you'd tell me if you needed the help. I would have, she said softly. He looked toward the cradle. She's a strong little thing. Bethany stirred the pot, the oats thickening with each turn. She is. Jackson pulled a chair from the table and sat, elbows on knees. His hands were rough and reddened from work, a small split across one knuckle. Bethany noticed it but said nothing. He wouldn't want fussing. I was thinking, he said, eyes fixed on the floorboards, about building a lean-to off the barn, just a small one. Keep the feed dry come winter. You'll need extra timber for that, she replied, setting a bowl before him. I saw some stacked by the old mill road last week, looked like it had been left. Jackson raised his brows. You went out that far? I had Zadie with me, just walking. Didn't stray past the split fence. His voice held no scolding, just quiet concern. Still, next time I'd rather you take Boone, just in case. She lowered herself onto the bench across from him. I can do that. He took a bite, then set his spoon down. You know, I've got kin. A sister back in Helena. Married a cattle broker. We haven't spoken much since our mother passed, but she still writes. Asked if I'd ever bring someone to visit. Bethany glanced up. You planning to? I might. Someday. He studied her. Would you want to go? If it came to that. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, her expression unreadable. I haven't thought farther than tomorrow in a long time, she said finally. But if it meant something to you, I'd consider it. He nodded, accepting that as truth. She'd like you, I think. She never was fond of women who talked too much. Bethany let out a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. Well, I've never been accused of that. Zadie stirred then, her breath shifting to small fusses. Bethany stood, lifting her gently, and cradled her against her shoulder. Jackson watched with something close to reverence, his jaw working like he had words but didn't quite trust them yet. I was wrong, he said after a pause. Bethany turned toward him, brow furrowed. About what? He met her eyes. You didn't just carry life. You built it. You shaped it with grief and grit and nothing but your own hands. She didn't reply right away. Her throat felt too tight. I didn't do it alone, she said at last. No, he agreed. You didn't. She stepped closer, Zadie between them. The baby's tiny fist curled against Bethany's collarbone, and Jackson reached out slowly, letting his hand rest lightly on the child's back. His voice dropped to a whisper. She's got your eyes. Bethany swallowed. I hope she's braver than me. You're the bravest person I know, he said. The clock on the shelf ticked on, steady and unhurried. Bethany shifted Zadie into one arm and reached for Jackson's hand with the other. His fingers closed around hers without hesitation, calloused, warm, certain. Outside, the rain softened, then stopped altogether. The land drank deep, and in the distance, the sky began to lighten. Bethany looked down at their joined hands. Jackson, he met her gaze. I don't know what this is between us, but I'd like to find out. He nodded once, eyes steady. We've got time, and we've got each other. She smiled then, tired and sure all at once. The kind of smile that could only come after loss and choosing love anyway. And in that small, quiet room, with the scent of oats still in the air and the sound of their daughter's breath between them, they stood side by side, two people who had been broken and built again, not by chance, but by choice. By early June, the hills turned a deeper green, and the scent of wet pine clung to the wind. Jackson had begun rising earlier, often gone before the first pale light reached the window. Bethany would find a note scratched onto brown paper, just a few words, never the same twice, always left beside a warm kettle or a fresh-cut apple. It wasn't the words that stayed with her, but the care behind them. That morning, she was out in the garden patch behind the house, knees damp from the soil, trying to coax the stubborn beans through the warming ground. Zadie lay nearby on a quilt, shaded by Bethany's wide-brimmed straw hat, her tiny hands grasping at the air. Boone stirred near the porch but didn't rise. He had started following Bethany more closely of late, ever since a fox had gotten into the henhouse. The dog had a new scar along his flank for his trouble, and a slower gait, but he still watched the land like it was his to guard. Jackson returned just after midday, leading the wagon with a single draft horse instead of his usual team. The second horse was missing, and the wagon bed was loaded with cut lumber and a dusty crate tied tight with rope. Bethany wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet him. "You lose the sorrel?" she asked, nodding to the empty trace. Jackson shook his head. "Swapped him in town. Man, there needed a sound animal for logging, offered the wood and a barrel of nails in trade. Figured it was fair, seeing as we won't be breaking new land this summer." Her eyes narrowed. "You did that for the lean-to?" He glanced at the crate. "And something else." She waited. He untied the rope, then pried open the lid. Inside sat a second-hand rocker, the kind with a low curve and wide arms, scuffed along the edges but still strong. He lifted it out and set it on the porch, then stepped back, uncertain. Bethany looked at it, then at him. "Wasn't sure if it'd be welcome," he said. "But I thought maybe, for evenings." She touched the back rail, the wood warm from the sun. Her voice was quiet. "It's more than welcome." Jackson nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. Later, after the sun dipped westward and the work was done, Bethany settled into the rocker with Zadie asleep across her chest. The motion soothed her in a way she hadn't expected. Jackson sat nearby on the steps, cleaning his boot knife with a cloth. "Have you thought about giving her a middle name?" he asked after a time. Bethany looked down at her daughter's small face, relaxed in sleep. "May," she said. "After my grandmother." Jackson nodded slowly. "She the one who taught you to sew?" "And to read," Bethany added. She kept to herself mostly, but she'd write poems on scraps and tuck them into the corners of the pantry. Said words where seeds took root when you least expected. Jackson tilted his head. "You ever write any?" Bethany hesitated. "Used to. Haven't in a long while." His gaze didn't leave hers. "Maybe you should." She looked away, not because she was unsure, but because the thought of creating something again with her own voice, her own hands, unsettled something inside her that had long been wrapped in silence. "I'll think on it," she said. He stood and moved to lean against the porch post beside her, his arm brushing hers. "I know it's early still," he said, voice low, "but I've been wondering how it'd feel, come fall, to have both your names on the deed." Bethany froze, breath held, heart skating into unfamiliar terrain. Jackson kept his eyes on the trees. "Not for show. Not to fix any past. Just because this place feels more like home with you in it." She shifted Zadie gently to one side, then set her hand over his. "I'd want that," she said, "but only if it means building a life, not just sharing the land." He turned toward her then, and she saw the answer in his face before he spoke. "Bethany," he said, "I've never wanted to build anything more." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rocker swaying slow beneath them. Zadie stirred once and settled again. The porch creaked beneath their weight. The wind rustled through the grass. And somewhere nearby, the first cricket of the season began its song, steady, sure, and full of promise. The last of summer ripened slow under a pale sky. The light held longer in the evenings, and Bethany had started laying aside preserved small jars of plum and chokecherry, lined up on the shelf near the hearth. Zadie had taken to crawling, her hands and knees quick across the wooden floor, her laughter sudden and bright when Boone let her tug his ears. Jackson had built a small gate across the kitchen entry to keep her from the stove, and Bethany had stitched padding for the corners of the table. It was a simple life, but it expanded around them like a house with more rooms than they'd first seen. Jackson came in with dust on his collar and a folded sheet of paper in his hand. He crossed to the table where Bethany was cutting strips of old muslin for a quilt lining. "It's from Helena," he said. "My sister's husband. She passed in April." Bethany set the fabric aside. "I'm sorry. She'd been sick a while." "I didn't know." He sat, rubbing his jaw. "He says she left something for me, a box of things she kept from when we were young. Letters. A brooch of our mother's. He'll send it if I ask." Bethany reached for his hand. "You should." Jackson looked at her, something unreadable behind his eyes. "You ever think about writing your folks?" "No," she said. "There's nothing I need from them." He nodded once, not pressing. "I just thought if you ever wanted to, I'd ride with you." Bethany didn't answer, but her grip on his hand tightened slightly. Later, when the lamps were lit and Zadie had fallen asleep with Boone curled nearby, Bethany stood at the doorway of the spare room. She leaned against the frame, arms folded. "I've been thinking I'd like to make it a sitting room," she said. "The spare room. Zadie sleeps better in our room anyway. And I could keep my sewing out where little hands can't pull it down." Jackson looked up from the ledger he was balancing. "That sounds right. I'd like to hang a shelf. For books. And maybe one of those drawings from the general store, the ones with the pressed flowers." He closed the book and stood. "I'll build the shelf tomorrow." She smiled. Quiet. "I know." They didn't speak of the future in grand terms. There were no declarations. But in the way Jackson reached for her waist as he passed, and the way Bethany leaned into the touch without pause, it was clear they had chosen one another wholly. In late August, they rode into Red Elk to have the deed amended. Jackson wore his best shirt, and Bethany tied her hair back with a ribbon the same color as the sky before a storm. Zadie rode in a sling against Jackson's chest, her head nestled under his chin. The man at the recorder's office looked between them, pen poised. "You're sure you want both names listed?" "Yes," Jackson said. "Bethany Brooks and Jackson Dwyer." The pen scratched across the paper. After they stopped at the dry goods store, Bethany picked out 2 lengths of cotton, one pale blue, one a warm rust, and a small tin of violet salve. Jackson bought a box of nails and a new bridle. The clerk, a woman with a kind mouth and sharp eyes, leaned across the counter. "You planning a wedding?" Bethany glanced at Jackson, who had stepped outside with Zadie. "No," she said. "We're already building what matters." "Well," the woman said, handing her the parcel, "if you ever do, I've got a bolt of lace that'd match your eyes." Bethany smiled, but said nothing. That night, Jackson brought a bottle of blackberry cordial out to the porch. They sat side by side in the rocker, Zadie already asleep. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the barn dance in 3 weeks. They hold it every fall, music, pie contest, the works." Bethany raised a brow. "You planning to enter the pie contest?" He laughed under his breath. "No, but I'd like to take you, if you'd let me." She leaned against his shoulder. "I'd like that." He passed her the cup, the cordial rich and sweet, and watched her as she took a small sip. "I've never danced before," she said. "I'll teach you." The night deepened around them. The porch creaked under the rhythm of the rocker. Jackson's hand rested over hers, and the quiet between them was filled with the contentment of people who had not rushed into love, but grown into it with the patience of seed to flower. They married the following spring, not in town, not with a preacher, but under the cottonwood tree near the creek where Bethany had first watched Jackson ride in from the ridge. A neighbor's wife recited words from a small, leather-bound book. Zadie toddled through the grass in a dress Bethany had stitched from the blue cotton. Boone stood sentinel nearby, his graying muzzle lifted to the breeze. There were no rings, but Jackson carved her a hair comb from juniper, and Bethany gave him a strip of embroidered linen stitched with their initials. Afterward, they shared bread, wild honey, and a small cake made from molasses and dried apples. Jackson held her hand as they watched the sun settle behind the hills. "Do you regret none of the pomp?" he asked, teasing. Bethany looked at him, her eyes full of quiet certainty. "This is everything I never thought I'd have. There is nothing missing." They grew older in the house between the hills. Bethany taught Zadie to read with the poems her grandmother had written. Jackson planted plum trees that blossomed white each spring. They added a second room when Zadie needed space to grow, and a third when Bethany's sewing took on orders from neighbors. They didn't speak of the past. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had already done its work, shaped them into people who knew the value of still mornings, of gentle hands, of love built slow and true. On their porch, in the heat of high summer, Jackson would sometimes reach over and trace the bones of her wrist, marveling not at how she had survived, but at how she had turned survival into something so tender. And Bethany, resting her head against his shoulder, would close her eyes and think not of what had been taken, but of what they had made. A life, stitched and weathered, whole.